Okay, that's good. Okay. All right, friends. Well, we're going to get going. This is, thank you for being here tonight. Thanks for being here on Zoom. And this is a special uh, episode of the Deeper podcast because it's going to be a live Q&A in relation to our current sermon series, Explore God. And we're going over the first three sermons that we've done so far, which are, is there purpose in life? Is there a God at all? And why is there so much evil and pain and injustice? Those three things. And just as a refresher, Explore God is a series, a sermon series. It's 7 parts that the Bay Church is doing with about 150 other churches in the Bay Area. Beautiful Christian unity sort of movement. But a lot of the questions that we're going over on weekends have layers and layers of depth that a Sunday morning sermon context just doesn't have space for. And that's as it should be. But the point of this is just a wide open Q&A to explore some of the deeper dimensions of these topics we've been covering the last few weeks. So I haven't come with a pre-prepared lesson. Have you, Destiny?
I have not.
Okay. Let me just introduce ourselves to friends maybe joining here by Zoom. My name's Ryan. I'm a pastor at the Bay Church. And this is my friend Destiny.
Hello.
And she's also an ordained pastor and has undergrad and master's in biblical studies, and so very learned. And we're just going to have kind of a conversation. So, does anybody have a question that you'd like to throw at Destiny?
Oh, hold on.
No, I'm just kidding. To throw at either of us, and we'll get the fun started. Awkward pause. Well, I'll get the conversation started with one thing that's been on my mind. The first sermon's question was, is there purpose in life? And I think that's a very common question. People want to know, does my life have purpose? Does life have purpose? But without getting right away to the answer, I think it's very instructive that we ask that question at all. Like, why is it that we even ask, is there meaning in my life? Is there purpose in my life? And that's a question that people across the board, regardless of your religious affiliation, have. And I think it's pointing to something fundamental about what human beings are that we see right from the very beginning of the Bible, is that God creates humans with a purpose, with a function. You are created in order to do these things. And so there's something innate in us that if there's a lack of purpose or lack of clarity surrounding my purpose as one person or the purpose of the species, the red light starts going in your head to say, like, that's not good. I need to have clarity about purpose. And that itself is an important piece of data about what it means to be human, is that we are creatures that insistently, innately, deeply ask these kinds of questions, and that itself is the beginning of an answer. A very famous book by the 20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, The Nature of Man, which it's usually a 2-part, The Nature and Destiny of Man. Hey, it's about you. The Nature and Destiny of Man. But it's often considered one of the most influential books of the 20th century, and it starts from this very curious feature of being human, that we have self-transcendence. The very fact that humans ask, what does it mean to be human, suggests that we're more than just basic animals. You don't see dogs doing that. You don't see any other species trying to like plumb the depths of what it means to be a dolphin or an ant or a bluebird or whatever. And so that very fact of self-transcendence is telling us, it's the beginning of an answer, I think, to some of the deeper questions in this.
Can I ask you a clarifying question?
Yeah.
When you refer to transcendence, are you referring to our ability to reflect upon ourselves?
Yes.
Okay.
So the idea, that's a great question. So transcendence means like, yeah, we can essentially occupy a position, as it were, looking at ourselves from the outside.
Right. That's what yeah.
And that itself is very interesting. It's unique. Yeah. Yeah. So
just a thought.
Yeah.
I think in line with what you're saying, when we think about purpose, the picture I also get is of direction, a yearning for direction. What am I toward? not just generally, but there's movement happening in life
Yes.
that we sense.
Yes.
Where am I going? Why am I going there? Who am I going with? Right? Like these aren't always the questions that we're asking when we talk about purpose, but in a sense, it's what we mean. And I think the biblical story, more than any other story, really addresses that pretty holistically.
Right. And one of the main features of the biblical story in this regard is it's something that's so obvious that it's hard for us to like really take on board sometimes. It's the reality of time.
Yes.
And the reality of history. The Bible tells a story that is history.
Right.
And so the question of purpose, that it's not just static. There's an historical dynamism, and Christianity is a historical religion that history is guided by God, by both God's providence and also God's promises. And both of those things factor into a Christian view of history. And this is one of the things that truly does distinguish Christian faith from other faith traditions, is that it is deeply attached to concrete historical events. The incarnation of Jesus, like, deeply, deeply obliges all Christian thinking to think about history. And so you can't get around it. Like, history really matters. And history and questions of purpose intermingle deeply. And personal history, my history, this one person, that one person, but then the larger sort of question of our history together.
Yeah. And you're touching on
Yes,
an aspect of this question that is important. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. That's important to kind of hone in on. The reality that there are purposes within purpose, capital P purpose.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Totally.
There is a story with stories.
Yes.
And somehow not for less important per se, but the more minor stories that live beneath the umbrella of the major story, what scholars might call the meta narrative, right? That narrative that oversees all other narratives. It's difficult to answer the smaller questions of why my story, why what's happened in my story, how do I make sense of this story and where it's going, without first beginning to address those larger narrative questions.
Right. Yeah. You think about it like, what's my calling? Well, if you're a Christian, the basic answer is my calling is actually into the family of God. My calling is to the gospel. And there's certain things that God asks of all Christians.
Right.
Like, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. Those aren't like sort of like, well, I've got the gift of patience. No, we're all obliged to develop patience. But we all do have a dimension of calling that is individualized. You're called to be an engineer. You're called to be, to work, I don't know, with children, or variety of specific callings. Okay, so B, howdy. And yes, please, everybody online, use the chat as a way to interact and throw in some questions. So type away, fire at will.
Can I turn on the game here? Are you guys not going?
Oops, let's see here.
Game just started.
How do we click mute on that? Oh, hey, Marilise. I know who that is. I know those people talking in the background. Okay, so here's a question that just came in. Let's see if I can make that go away. All right. How do you contend with the problem of omniscience in a Christian worldview? Yeah, that's a good question. Especially because, so let me define the question. Omniscience means God is all-knowing. And, the word science is in there, omniscience, essentially, because the very idea of science is knowledge. That's where we get words like conscience, consciousness. All these things have the Latin root of the idea of knowledge in it. So, B, it's a good question because the very unfolding of history in the Bible and the fact that what scholars call the contingencies of history, well, it went that way, but it could have gone that way, depending on a number of factors or whatever. Does that call into question God's knowledge in advance? And moreover, the Bible often has God posing humans tests. For example, the book of Deuteronomy says, God tested you these many years in the desert so that he might know what's in your heart. But then the question is, wait a minute, did God not know something? Did God stand in need of gaining knowledge? And that itself is, that very posing of a question is a clash of two different sorts of frameworks. There is one that's the very concept of omniscience is very much a sort of a Greek academy inspired sort of category. It's not exactly a biblical category, which is not to say that the biblical God is not all knowing, but the biblical God is a person. And what that means is not, a person does not equal human being, although humans are persons. In a theological sense, a person is an entity, a
agent,
an agent, yes, capable of desiring things, self-communication, action, and all of those things are true of God. And so there's very much been a philosophical captivity of the biblical God, where categories like omniscience, omnipresence, there's some other omnis out there, that those are sort of like retroactively placed upon the Bible, which then makes God as a dynamic character in the history of Israel, in the history of the world, a more of a puzzling thing. And again, it's not to say that those kinds of categories cannot shine helpful light. It's not to say that they're not Christian, but it is to say you have to recognize where these ideas came from and be sure that you're not inadvertently holding the Bible hostage to words, frameworks, expectations that are themselves coming from outside the Bible. And also, let me also just say, B, that the question about God's omniscience, also from a Christian theological standpoint, has to be considered in light of the Trinity and the knowledge of Father, Son, and Spirit. And in what sense is Jesus omniscient in the Garden of Gethsemane? In what sense is Jesus omniscient on the cross? Quoting from Psalm 22:1, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Or
can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
You're actually touching on something important, which I think is actually helpful in, if we're going to say sometimes putting these categories onto the Bible, or trying to put, a square thing in a round hole, what then do we look to in the narrative to wrestle with these ideas? And I think one of the vehicles that I see pretty frequently is prayer. Prayer is a place and a theme, like thematically in scripture, where both the people in the narrative as well as you, the reader, get the opportunity to wrestle with that deep mystery of how is it that God knows, and what does he know, and how far does he know? And then also coming to grips with our humanity in that place, in lament, in prayer, in searching. And so we see that in the Psalms, we see that in Moses's journey, in Moses's somehow ability to stand in the gap and be somewhat of a Christ figure, asking God to put on him what should be on the Israelites, right? There's all these things where you're like, does God know? Or why is he testing that person? And, and so it doesn't always resolve that, but at the same time, it gives you a vehicle to wrestle with it. And so I think that that's at least what I see in the biblical text, giving us that opportunity still, not squashing it entirely.
Well said. Well said. And thanks, B. Something that I think my doctoral advisor wrote at one point on the question of how do we understand God's purpose in suffering and all that stuff. And let's see. Hey, friends, if you're on Zoom, would you help us out and just mute yourself, just so that we're not hearing a bunch of background stuff? Thank you. The idea that what we mean by knowledge and what knowledge means to God are radically different things.
Yeah, that's a really good
to
point.
Assume that my question about omniscience is taking my human idea of what counts as knowledge and asking how much of that God has is already to be on the wrong track. Because and this is where we talk about God in analogical terms that have to do with our human experience, God's mind, God's knowing, God's intention, and so forth. But those ways aren't wrong ways about talking about God, but they're not fully right either. They're sort of the least wrong way of talking about God. There are more wrong ways of talking about God. These are the least wrong ways of talking about God, but to assume that our language has a perfect one-to-one correspondence with who God really is already, well, it's already to make certain core assumptions about humanity that may not be valid. And so, part of the thing here is God is at a certain fundamental level mysterious, but a whole thread of the Bible is that God wants to be known by us. Like the whole point of this book is God saying, I want to be known by you. Come know me. I want to. And it's not that I wouldn't know you otherwise, God speaking to us, but God saying, I want you to voluntarily open yourself to me. I want you to offer yourself to me. And this is where you're so right, Destiny, to bring up the question of prayer. And like in Romans chapter 8, talks about the whole world is groaning like in labor pains, and the Spirit bears witness with our spirit, and the Spirit searches God and searches the inside of us. And prayer is in this mystery of pain and hope. And it goes so far beyond just human destiny. It has to do with the destiny of all of creation. And the type of communication that is prayer, the type of knowledge that is prayer, is at the heart of this mystery. And so that's why I'm inspired by a definition of a theologian that is used by the church in the East, the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox churches. For them, there have not been many theologians in history. In fact, very few theologians. Whereas in the West, theologians are people who go study theology, and now you're a theologian. In the East, only a very, very few people are theologians, because a theologian is not someone who talks about God. A theologian is someone who knows God. And very few people have truly got to that level of knowing God. So of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Christian tradition is only one of them is a theologian, and that's John. There's just a different.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
but prayer is so vital to that. And this was so weird for me. I've known a lot of theologians who are extremely private about their prayer life, and I don't even know if they have one. I think they're very cynical, skeptical. You just don't get the sense that prayer is towards at the beating heart of their theological vocation.
mm-hmm.
But that just proves that maybe you've misunderstood the theological vocation.
Or perhaps we've overestimated what we're capable of knowing. I don't think we're incapable of knowing anything. I think there's a great deal to be discovered, both in knowing God as well as in the study of theology and biblical theology and of God. But we are so out of touch frequently with our limitations.
Yes. So this is a very key topic, actually, Destiny. A book I'd like to recommend to you it's by a philosopher economist named Thomas Sowell. He's at Stanford at the Hoover Institution, and it's called A Conflict of Visions. And in this book, Thomas Sowell, he's an African-American political philosopher. He's not a theologian, but in the book, he outlines two basic views of human nature that have sat beneath a great variety of different views of the world and of society. And there's tons and tons of different frameworks out there, but Thomas Sowell's argument is they really all fall into two buckets. One bucket is called the unconstrained vision, and one is called the constrained vision. Start with the constrained vision. The constrained vision, which is very affiliated with religious traditions, views humans as constrained. There's only so much we can know and do and be. There are limitations, and you got to work from within those limitations. The unconstrained vision, which is very characteristic of modern thought, says no, in principle, there's no limit to what humans can know, to what humans can do and be. And those two core assumptions, whether you view human nature as constrained or unconstrained, systematically works its way through a variety of different issues. And the biblical view is that humans are constrained, but that's not a counsel of despair. That's not to say you're pathetic, little limited creatures. It's actually through the incarnation of Jesus, it's a glorious thing.
It's a paradox.
It is,
which we shouldn't be surprised about because the Bible just loves those. It's a tension and a paradox that we also experience. Somehow, me as a limited being, when I, not just in a frilly, idealistic way, but like when I really come and touch ground on my limitations, my human frailty, the what I cannot access, I realize I've reached my limits. Somehow that sets me free to engage in accepting a deep mystery about how incredible God is, and it strikes awe and the fear of God that leads to continued obedience. Like it just opens up a world of so much more. I don't know how to describe that. Do you see what I'm saying?
absolutely.
And I just find that very interesting. Again, the kind of lowering oneself for hiring oneself, and again, not in a bad way, like we're just the scum of the earth or something like that. We can't do anything. But accessing new aspects of our limitations somehow is, it's a paradox.
It's a paradox. Let me, by the way, let me just say one thing about paradox. Paradox is a, existential philosopher like Soren Kierkegaard popularizes the idea of a paradox, but the more classical Christian term for a paradox is mystery.
Mystery, yes.
And many of the traditional heresies that the church has said, nope, that's out of bounds, have been things that have been too clear, too precise, too schematized. Flowchart, here's the Trinity. And the church has been like, no, you're not appreciating the depths of mystery here.
The vastness.
And so that's an important thing. Okay, so B's got another question. So you're trying to say that the concept of omniscience would be similar to the level of unfathomable, so to speak, concept of the Trinity and how it works. So it's naive to assume that we can know or try to understand with our own juvenile concepts that we have available to us. So good question, B. And this is where actually what we've just been talking about, the idea of paradox, balance, mystery, is very relevant, because just because we cannot know everything does not mean we should not try to know something. In fact, a huge part of God's vocation for the human species turns a great deal on knowledge, turns a great deal on prudence and discretion and clear thinking. When the Apostle Paul describes the Christian life in the New Testament, over and over again, in many ways, he hits on the idea that it's about turning on your brain. It's about baptizing your cognition. And so this is a totally false assumption that the more spiritual I am, the more in tune with God I am, the less I have to think. And therefore I can just kind of go with the flow and the Spirit will lead me. And plus I can't know everything. That's actually backwards. The more spiritual you are, the more clearly you will think, the more you will know. Curiosity is a gift of God, and to be exercised and developed, but it's not to be used towards the Tower of Babel, where I'm going to build myself up to the heavens to make a name for myself, because who needs God? That's where knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So knowledge is itself, think about the entree to human brokenness is at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, so knowledge itself, its role in the human life, is a central part of the Christian mystery, and Jesus comes to redeem knowledge in many ways.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
We use the word knowledge to encompass any number of things, including thought, but there are ways we understand this fundamentally, we just don't speak this way about it. There are ways of knowing that are not thought.
Oh, yes.
Right. And I'm curious to know, how does the biblical story flesh out knowledge?
Yes. Oh, great question. So, yeah, and we could do a whole session just on this topic. So the biblical word for knowledge, the root in Hebrew is 3 letters. Most Hebrew words have three letter roots. Yud Dalet Ayin. It's yada, and that word is taken. It can take different shapes, but it is translated in a variety of quite different contexts. So there is the idea of knowledge, of like sort of like, you tell me something and I can regurgitate it back to you because now I know it.
Right, sure.
But knowledge also is often used for sexual intimacy in the Bible, and Cain knew his wife, or Adam knew his wife and she gave birth to us. So it's a deep type of relational knowledge, embodied knowledge. It's also often used in covenantal contexts to know if the people will really know God. So it's knowledge that births commitment, that births action. It's not just cerebral and abstract. It is put in play in the real world. And we know from modern sociology, psychology, various disciplines about just your point is so very accurate. The vast majority of information that we are operating on is not conscious. It is far beneath our level of like, oh, I know that I'm thinking about that thing right now. A great deal of it is emotional, instinctive, hormonal. But God made all of these layers of knowledge. The fact that you have reflexes that will save your life someday is a great gift from God. The fact that you have emotions that actually give you insight that your logical minds cannot access, that's a great gift from God. In fact, people who do not have access to their emotions or not self-aware of their emotions are often have mental challenges, because if you're overly analytical, if you're solely analytical, that's a handicap actually.
Yeah, and I don't want to over materialize this statement, and you'll know what I mean. But as embodied beings, and I'm not just referring to what we can see, touch, and feel, but like as a being, our whole self made by God, I almost think of ourselves as like an instrument, somehow able to pick up on these wavelengths, like we're able to pick up on a kind of knowing that is different than thought. It doesn't exclude thought, but it's just very interesting that we've kind of partitioned ourselves to believe, well, I know when I think. And I think as it relates to the earlier question of omniscience, perhaps God has these ways of knowing that they're just not familiar to us, or they're just not the way that we usually talk about knowing. And so we might be unhelpful to ourselves sometimes in identifying a particular category that keeps us almost sandwiched in a spot where we're like, well, if we can't answer it this way, then I guess there's no answer. And I don't know that that's fair to the conversation.
Yeah. And no, well said. And a couple of weeks ago in my sermon, I used a quote from Oliver O'Donovan, who's a theologian at Oxford, and he defines knowledge. And he talks about knowledge. I'll paraphrase it. He says, knowledge is the perception of differing fields of vision as one universe. So the idea is that we see different ways, we know different ways, but at a high level, knowledge is the integration of those different ways of knowing in a single map of reality. And that's the quest. And that's where a lot of the sort of interdisciplinary environment of the modern academy in many ways has punted on the question of knowledge, because it's not seeking a sort of an integrated metaphysic. It's much more. There's a very famous metaphor by a guy named Isaiah Berlin. He was a 20th century thinker, essayist, and he talks about there's two different types of minds. There are people who are foxes, and there are people who are hedgehogs. Has anybody ever heard of this? The fox and the hedgehog?
Never.
Oh, so this is a pretty well-known analogy. And the idea is if you're a fox, the fox knows many things, and the fox comes at different angles, whereas the hedgehog knows only one great thing, and like a hedgehog circles up into itself, and it just kind of like it's a theory of everything kind of person. So there's the fox and the hedgehog. And the fox has ruled the roost of the academy for a very long time, the university. We know a lot of little things, but sort of like one big concept that like That's taboo.
Wondering to rule them all.
There's yeah. But there's a famous legal theorist named Ronald Dworkin, Dworkin, who's published a book in the last while called Justice for Hedgehogs. And his basic idea is to say it's totally not fair that y'all are rolling on a theory of knowing that is fox-based. There are important central ideas in the world. There are hedgehog type ways of knowing, and those are very important. But people who are hedgehogs are often looked at as kind of charlatans, kind of quacks. But that's the classical vision of knowing. It's the universitas is the whole that is, multiple types of vision brought together in one. I want to give a chance, though, for us to explore some other topics besides the nature of knowledge, although I love that topic. Are there any other questions on different, just as a review, we're going over 3 sermons that we've done. Is there purpose in life? Is there God? And why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? And so are there any questions in anywhere in that neighborhood that you guys might have? Yes.
Haley Rain.
I know you briefly touched on like patterns of God in nature. Like you talked about it in youth group too, like 3 parts of that and stuff like that. And I just find that stuff really interesting. So I was wondering if there's like any books about that just like gives a lot more information on that, because I think that stuff is really cool. Yeah,
great question. I'll repeat it for friends online. So in a sermon, we talked about how reality has a relational properties to it. I mean, the building blocks are relational networks at the atomic level, at the quantum level, at the nature of gravity and so forth. And that is like a stamp of the Trinity. It's the signature of the artist, that God has put something of his Trinitarian community of love into the nature of the world that we live in. And so this, Haley Rain, is an area of theology. It's called natural theology. And the idea is, and natural theology is a very long-standing and complex subfield of theology. And its basic idea is, what can we know of God, the theology part, from nature, from the natural world? That is to say, if we didn't have a Bible, could humans still know God? What could humans know about God without this? And because this represents revelation, it represents things that God makes known to us that we otherwise couldn't know. But as St. Augustine famously said, God gave us 2 books. God gave us the natural world, and God gave us the Bible. And we learn about him from both. So to your question, is there a book that explores that? I don't know. The book that I would suggest is Francis Collins' The Language of God. And he is a very famous scientist who's a Christian as well, who was the lead. He was the point person for what's called the Human Genome Project. This was a very, very important scientific global endeavor, hundreds of scientists who are mapping human DNA. And it has major impact for the type of medicine that's practiced today. The type of cures that are out there are owing to the Human Genome Project. Anyways, he's written a book called The Language of God, where he describes things in the genetic realm, but other things too, as expressing who God is. I think that might be a good place to start. And I'll try to think of if there's any more in that realm. But great question. Science should not only not threaten our faith, it should accelerate it. It should give you ample, unending reasons to say, wow, you did all this? Wow, you thought of that too? Wow. And I mean, so for me, science was a huge feature of bringing me to faith, even though at first it might have been presented to me as a barrier to faith. Like, oh, well, you better stay away from those scientists. They don't believe in God. Well, actually, some of the most profound scientists do believe in God. And many, I'm not talking about like B-level scientists. I'm talking about A-level scientists. They are very often the people who are most open to the realm of mystery, because they are at the edge of order. And they're like, this is things are quirky beautiful. Like there's dimensions that we do not know, and so scientists, and I'm not talking about B-level scientists. I'm talking about the people doing real research. They're often the people who are most open to a posture of humility. When I was at Harvard, the Christian group I was a part of once had the chair of the Harvard physics department come talk to us, and he's a Christian guy from the Midwest, but I mean, like, this guy's an elite scientist, and he'd spent an hour plus with us, and he said one phrase he said over and over again. He said, "We serve a very big God, and we are very little people." He said that many times, like, we are little people. Because this man's whole life is spent exploring the vastness of the universe. And he's just like, we're very little. And he meant it. And that's what I'm talking about. Like somebody who's a genuine scientist who arrives to the real conclusion. This is the only real conclusion, is that we are very little people.
And the beauty of the result of experiencing such vastness and awe for the Christian is wonderful, because it's not
right. It's not terrifying.
It's not folding to futility or lovelessness, or I'm just being lost to the universe.
Right.
But it kind of echoes what David says, who am I that you're mindful of me? And yet you are, like, you're so, like, who am I that you care for me? And
yes.
And God does. And we can enter that vastness and that mystery and that awe without feelings of, well, I guess I'm just lost in all of it. But there's a particularity to God seeing me in the midst of all that he's created.
Yeah. So let me say a couple things here. One, another little Harvard anecdote. In the center of Harvard Yard, Harvard, if you've never been there, it's like Jerusalem today, where there's like an old city. And so there's Harvard Yard, which is like the classic part of the university. But then the university today sprawls out all through Cambridge. But in Harvard Yard, the Hall for Philosophy is called Emerson Hall. And that's where Ralph Waldo Emerson, famous ex-Christian, interesting guy. Anyways, when they were building this building, they were planning to put up on the frieze, the panel right up above the roof, an engraving. And they had planned to put the engraving, "Man is the measure of all things." And that represents a very modern belief. Although that's an ancient statement, it's a modern belief that humans are at the center of things. This is technically called anthropocentrism. Humans are at the center. Well, the Harvard president got wind of this, and a devout person, this is the legend, and even if it's not true, it's pretty interesting. He apparently said last minute, "Nope, you are not putting that on that building. I want you to replace it with Psalm 8. I don't want man is the measure of all things. What I want is, what is man that thou art mindful of him?" And so that, that's what you were just saying. And so that's now stuck there. And from a sort of pure materialist scientific viewpoint, the idea is that we humans are stardust. It's kind of a poetic way of saying, what does that mean? It means that on planet Earth, the variety of chemical compounds, the variety of atoms that we have are actually the product of stellar explosions, stars forming and destroying, and that tremendous, that's not a word, tremendous, intense heat and pressure creates new elements. And so the idea is that our bodies, which have so many different elements in them, are like stardust, are the product of eons and eons of explosion and so forth. But that assumes that everything is purely material and there's not a legitimate spiritual dimension of the world. For Christians, the word human is not a biological designation. It is a spiritual designation. It is a creature into whom God has given the gift of his image. And so even if you dig up old fossils that look like they walk on 2 feet and look like they had opposable thumbs, that doesn't necessarily mean they were human in the theological sense of a creature into whom God has given his very image. And so, yeah, you could talk in terms of stardust or whatever, and maybe at a sheer material level, there's some truth to that. And I think it's pretty amazing and cool. But it's asking a different type of question than the type of question that the Bible is getting to, which is about purpose. What are humans for? What is their vocation? It's not asking how are they made. It's asking what are they made for? And so very often, extremely influential lies grow out of the seed of unexamined questions, asking the wrong questions and assuming they're the right questions. So yeah, this whole area I think is very interesting. All right, Marilise has a question. Howdy, Marilise. How do you talk to youth? I don't. Just kidding. How do you talk
it's
to?
It's okay, I do.
How do you talk to youth? Don't care. Next, just kidding. About helping them find their purpose if they haven't begun a relationship with God yet. I find that speaking about God or the Bible first sometimes alienates youth. Do you want to tackle that, Destiny?
Sure. So just kind of as a background for my ability to speak on this. So I actually for about 5 years.
Were you a youth?
I was a youth for about 8 years, but after that point, I actually received a grant from a Christian trust that allowed for me and a team at my university that I graduated from to start a program specifically to address this issue of how does one as a young student discern vocation or what my purpose in life is. And a lot of the students would come to us, granted these were Christian students, so I will answer your question in terms of non-Christian students, but these were Christian students who came assuming that what we were basically going to help them do was pick a undergrad degree and, help them discover a little bit more about what they're good at. But that fundamentally misses what the Bible is trying to get us to realize first. I don't know that God is on a particular mission in the scriptures to help us understand per se, what we're going to do in our 9 to 5, but he's certainly concerned with our formation as people and certainly concerned with our calling to him primarily. I'm not going to say that God is not involved in us discovering who we are uniquely, but when it comes to a student, they're experiencing such a depth of pressure to know things about themselves that we don't even give them tools to discover. And then we say at the age of 18, well, I hope you know what you want to do with the rest of your life, and then set them free to hopefully figure that out. And then we get upset when they spend thousands of our dollars on college and they're like, Mom, I don't want to end up, I don't want to go into nursing, or I don't want to do this. And so we're frustrated, right? All that to circle back to the reality. How do I begin conversations with my student about purpose? And I think before we even ask that question, it's how do we help our students encounter the person that made them? How do we help our students encounter the person of love that is God, the God of the scriptures? And so I would really encourage you, whether it's a Christian student or a non-Christian student, to lean into their interests. What do they already talk about? What lights them up already? How can you engage in that in such a way that allows you both relational space as well as creative space to begin to ask the deeper questions about who they are and what God might be up to in their life, the kind of questions that they're asking. I think what we do sometimes is we assume what they're asking rather than just leaning into their lives, getting interested in what they're interested in, and then going from there. And also, sorry,
okay, so I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, well, what if I'm a 17-year-old senior in high school?
Mm-hmm.
I like video games,
mm-hmm.
And not much else.
Okay.
Like I like video games, and I'm not really sure what the future holds, but my parents really want me to like attach to something bigger or some purpose or whatever. But I don't know. I don't know what I like. I don't really know what I'm good at, but I do like video games. How are you gonna interact with me?
I would try to enter that space with you. I mean, truthfully, I think honestly, just in terms of the conversation of technology, animation, the creativity that just explodes across their screen all the time is a great opportunity for you to begin to enter that conversation rather than just saying, you're melting your brain and I'm so angry with you. Like if your student really won't leave their computer, enter their space, get involved. Hey, I know this seems weird and you're probably like, Mom, get out of my space. Like, I want to know, why do you love this stuff? Why does it make your heart beat so much? Why do you stay? What's so cool about it? Is this something that you would want to pursue later on? Maybe, I don't know. You might get one word answers, and that's okay. Persistent love is patient. It enters in regularly, and it says, I'm not here just to get what I want out of this. I'm here to genuinely understand you. And I think that experience really rings true with teenagers. And as they grow, you may have more conversations as they become an adult.
Thank you. She's a youth pastor at our church, and they've got an amazing youth group, her and her husband, Nathan. And let me just add just a statement about history. It is very abnormal historically that we even ask such questions today. Like, what do I want to do when I grow up? Who have I been made to be? Those are questions that only in the last 50 years people have started to ask. If your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. The end. So there's certain questions that we burden ourselves with that I think we're not well equipped to answer. Like humans, when we're on a consistent existential quest for the real me, that often burns us out because we're not built to answer those kinds of questions all the time. And even if you don't have to go back in history, if you go to like Germany today, you take a test when you're 13 or 14 for your aptitudes, you get put into one of 3 types of high schools, and you major in high school. You don't major in college, you major in high school, and then you're a practicing physician or lawyer or mechanic or whatever by the age of 21, 22, and it is extremely hard to change tracks. So I started college as a business major, and I was like, no, I'm going to do communications. And I'm like, no, I'm going to do biblical literature. But that very freedom to do that's not a thing in other parts of the world. So that's just another thing to bear in mind, that the type of question that you're asking is uniquely Western American, millennial kind of question. And it's amazingly cool that we get to ask it, but it's by no means it's by no means what all humans of all times have been asking, And
it's often flipped, maybe the biblical model more on its head by starting with fulfillment and passion and what am I going to be the greatest at? What can I make the most money with? How can I fulfill this deep longing to do something that I enjoy, again, which is a unique privilege to even pursue today. But I think the biblical model kind of turns it on its head, and again starts with love that ends up leading to obedience, relational engagement that then leads to deep resonating fulfillment that doesn't always come from doing the things you're passionate about. So just a food for thought.
Well said. And as someone who doesn't have children, I stand by everything I said, because I'm sure I will be humbled by it someday.
Yeah.
My wife's sitting right there. Lord willing, I'll be humbled. Let's I just want to keep in the spirit of Q&A. Hey, there's my wife has a question. Yes, Sarah.
So a couple weeks ago, you preached on Is There a God? And I think one of your points is we can't know God merely through intellectual means. And we need this kind of lens, almost like 3D glasses you talked about in the
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, someone close to me is very doubtful and cynical of God and Christian worldview. And I just wish I could give them these glasses. And it can often feel like it's just by a miracle that some people get access to this kind of lens, these 3D glasses. So is it just by a miracle that some people get to see, God in this way?
That's a great question.
Will you rephrase it for those who didn't hear?
I will, yeah. So the question was actually circling back to kind of what's been our theme tonight, which is knowledge of God. And what if you have somebody close to you, you really want to know God, but they just don't. They don't have interest in it. And in a sermon, we use the metaphor of like, if you go to a 3D movie and you're sitting in the movie theater, but you don't have the glasses and all you're seeing is a flat screen and it's just fuzzy and blurry and you're getting a headache. while everyone around you is like being swept up in this story, and they're just like, it's coming off the wall. And the question is, well, how do you give somebody the 3D glasses if they don't have it and they don't want it? And this is why Christian theologians have often talked about conversion or coming to God as the very impulse towards God is called prevenient grace. It's the beginning of grace that we even are open to the question. And there is a deep level of the miraculous there. Now, this gets distorted in certain doctrines of sort of double predestination. God overdetermines those who get to know and who don't. And God both says, sorry, you don't get to know, and I'm holding you accountable for it. So I'm gonna damn you because I was the one who turned off your spigot of knowledge. Okay, how fair is that? And that's a sort of a caricature of certain streams of Calvinism. Calvin himself is a much more sophisticated thinker. Calvin's a lawyer. He's very aware of many sides of an argument and everything. It is often said, as someone who teaches the Bible, I think about how do people latch on to spiritual truth? And it's very often people are most receptive when they're in a place of crisis.
I was going to say pain, baby.
Yeah,
pain drives us to important questions and keeps us there, willing to listen.
So it's a crisis, or you're on a quest.
Mm-hmm.
You're like you're on a driven quest for truth, and you're going to find truth. And then you're actually an early adopter. You're actually seeking yourself. But what preachers often do then is try to create a rhetorical crisis, try to create a sort of like a tension or collision that provokes in you that willingness to know something that you don't otherwise know. Because it's well said that the prophets of the Bible, they don't come to tell us things that we don't know. They come to tell us things we won't know. It's the things that we desire not to know. And that's the nature of bias, right? Bias says, I don't want to know that. It doesn't work with my narrative. Sorry, I'm going to screen that out. And so at a deep level, Sarah, I think the answer to your question is, I think this is another mysterious both and. It is both the case on the one hand that the fact that any one human being is awakened to the desire to know God, that's a miracle on the one hand. Side by side with that, not to be discarded, is the reality that humans have a responsibility to seek these things out. And if we deliberately do not seek these things out, if they have been offered to us and we just kind of punt them aside and say, nope, sorry, not interested, the Bible is clear that we are held accountable for that, actually. And so knowledge, what we know or don't know, is not entirely neutral. Actually, there's moral consequence.
Don't play near the neighbor's house, okay? Oh.
2 seconds here. We're going to try to mute somebody. Okay, maybe that was okay. So does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. And it's terribly challenging because we want, like, it's the movie theater example is, I think, a good one. You're sitting there next to somebody who's really not enjoying this, who thinks it's all stupid. And you're like, but if you would just look like this, you would understand what's going on here. And it's really quite interesting. And so this is a classic, like, how do I do that? And I don't know if there's a clear answer to that, other than prayer, friendship, and in line a little bit with what Destiny was saying, enter into their world, so if somebody, some of my best friends are scientists, or they were when I was in grad school. And, entering into their world is just it earns you the right to be heard, or the right to say things of weight. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple things, because I've wrestled with this regularly as well. And I just want to affirm that this is hard. We see scriptures like in Acts where somebody gets up and shares something, and then 3,000 people decide to give their
That's
life.
What happens every time I preach. It's really
it's frustrating when you're like, I just want my loved one to know Christ like I do, or just at all, right? I would encourage you to pray for a stirring in the times where I'm just like, I don't know how to pray, what to pray for. Pray for them to be stirred. The Holy Spirit to stir them to whatever it is that they need awakening towards. I can't assume. I might think, oh, well, they're living with their boyfriend, so that's what you need to convict them about first, God. Perhaps not at all. The Lord will get there. God will clean house, and he knows the order in which to do it. And so just inviting God to stir, to create curiosity. And then another thing that I've noticed is helpful, surprise them with celebration. Celebrate any opportunity you can where they're talking about something or asking a question that you're like, you know what, actually, I think about that too. Isn't it so weird that, X, Y, or Z, we're here and we're all trying to figure out what this is all about or whatever. And there's no need to make it cheesy, but very naturally celebrate the moments where they're like leaning into life's meaning, and then engage them there. And like Ryan said, be a friend, and maybe don't make them so taboo. I think people who are not Christians, we often make them feel like they're kind of weird people who are trying to micromanage because your behavior makes me uncomfortable, rather than just being near to them as a friend, leaning into their life, and in any ways that they open up to us, inviting the sharing of God's wisdom and celebrating God's wisdom as something awesome, not just hey, it would be really nice if you behaved differently,
Yeah. Great question. And people are so different that how you relate to any one person is going to vary tremendously. And
that's good.
So there's not a one size fits all here. And anybody else have questions? My friend Isaac has been quiet, but I know he's got a lot of questions.
And it can divert from what we have spoken about thus far.
Yeah. But no pressure. No pressure. And Nicholas, yes? Welcome. Was it Nicholas?
Yes, Nicholas.
Nicholas, nice to see you again. Okay, no worries. No worries. B, sounds like you might have a question. Feel free to type it in there. Or yes, please.
Is it is there a mention? I just have a close friend that invites us to come to the service. And she said, well, I need my higher power. And I said, oh, great. And then is that pursue more? And she said, yeah, I believe in universe. And I was getting great. I sat last night outside and I looked up at the stars. And I was thinking, what's up there is higher than who made the stars? Would there be sometimes that my friends who believe in the universe break it open and go beyond that to know that there is something about?
Yeah. That's a great question. Let's try to rephrase it. Some people will often speak in kind of big, broad strokes. I believe in the universe. And it's sort of a way of saying sort of spiritual, but not religious. I believe there are forces that I feel things, and it's wow, it moves me, but I'm not committed to any one particular tradition or whatever. It's not like I'm going to like sign off on doctrine. Doctrine's often held as like a bad thing. Ooh, doctrine, it's limiting, whatever, because I believe in the universe. And it's a type of if they mean that strictly, then it's a type of pantheism or panentheism, the idea being that the universe itself is God, that God is everything around us, or God is like everything in the universe is like inside God, like it's a bubble inside something even bigger than the universe or whatever. These are very old viewpoints. Also, they're not at all new. A lot of people who kind of fancy themselves to be sort of like, oh, I've come up with this new idea that I just don't think people like understand. It's like, yeah, that's only like 4,000 years old, and people have been riffing on that idea for a very, very long time. So it's very hard to come up with any new idea. Like it's actually like almost impossible. So yeah, I think there's a lot of very unformed viewpoints out there, and they're often either lazy or punting or there's Do you have anything to add, Destiny?
I mean, this is becoming more popular. Just the spiritual but undefined. And I struggle to even use that language about it, because we just discussed that there is beauty to mystery and the experience of not knowing everything. But I think it's important to reaffirm that some things can be known, and that we affirm as Christians that God has chosen to reveal himself. He is a thing that exists, a person existing outside of, so to speak, the constraints of what we experience as human beings. And he has decided to self-reveal. And thank God for that, very literally. But on the side of this kind of undefined spiritualism, I'll put it in the example of a person. There's someone actually who goes to our church who is very involved in this type of thinking, recently became a Christ follower. And something she was sharing with me was that it just lacks so much grounding. So that the actual experience of adhering to or living your life in such a way that it really acknowledges that the universe is kind of just this energy flowing through stuff, or that it kind of just works how it wants, is incredibly chaotic. And it is incredibly difficult to make decisions about your life. Right. It is incredibly difficult to know what success is or fulfillment is, and how does that work? I mean, there's just no framework at all. And so you're just swimming in this ocean of vastness, visiting people who say that they get in touch with spirits or things or the universe, and it's telling them something, but then 2 months later it tells them something different about you, and it is just chaos, and it unleashes so much insecurity. So you look for more control, and you meet more people who say that they are in contact with the universe or spirits or whatever, and this is kind of mix and matching certain different types of spiritualism that are common. But the experience tends to be the same in terms of what people report. It's just incredibly chaotic, and it gives a sense of control for a little while, without any kind of commitment to anything in particular, which appeals to a lot of people, because it's like, well, if I meet God, I feel like I'm not going to like him because he's going to want me to do some things that I just can't be bothered to do right now. And I don't want to be uncharitable to people to pretend like they are just always trying to avoid responsibility. But I think it's also fair to say that like that is an appealing aspect of this. And there's kind of this like, oh, I get to acknowledge a higher power without feeling that I need to be deeply relationally committed to any person or anything but myself. Right.
I think that very, very well said. And that the deep sort of poles underneath what she's saying are, is your life open? Is there are there dimensions of authority in your life, or is autonomy the ultimate question? Mm-hmm. And so there's a philosopher at Princeton named what's his name? I met the guy once, but anyways, he wrote a book called The Flight from Authority, and he's basically tracing modern thought. It's a sort of history of modern thought thematized around a fundamental rejection of authority of all sorts. And this has been written in a variety of different, this theme has been explored and explored and explored, but a revulsion of, towards authority of any sort. And what's replaced authority is autonomy. And so Destiny, for a lot of people, the quest for self-invention, for coming up with my own moral framework, deciding what my own idea of success is. And I'm actually afraid of answers, because answers smell of authoritativeness. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just going to keep constantly complexifying everything and asking more and more questions. That itself, in a particular framework, is seen as responsibility. Mm-hmm. It is morally responsible to do that. And it's morally irresponsible to accept authority, because authority is always evil. Authority is always dangerous.
Or oppressive.
And oppressive and all that. So, and we're painting in big, broad strokes here, but it's just important to see that if there is a God, that is indeed quite inconvenient. If you also if you've imbibed this idea that the good life is the autonomous life, because Jesus says, sorry, the way is pretty narrow and it's pretty steep, and it's going to hurt, but it's the only way. And by the way, you say you love me, but if you don't do what I say, you don't love me, because love is obedience. And so like, this is where it's like, wait a minute, I thought Jesus was all about fuzzies and like nice stuff. But it's like, yeah, well, there's a hard demand here too. And that's very distasteful to a lot of people. And it would be distasteful to me too, had I not experienced from the inside. This is like the ultimate mystery of Christian faith. And Jesus hits it many, many times. And the Old Testament tells stories about this many, many ways, is that when we lose ourselves, we find ourselves. When we die, that's when we come to life. When we lay down our self-interest, that is when we experience a dimension of living tremendously beyond it. And so obedience for a Christian is not a dirty word or something like, oh yeah, well, I guess we kind of got to do it. It's actually a form of deeper liberation, but that can only really be experienced from inside. It's hard to kind of articulate it to somebody who's like,
that's a great
you're clearly off your rocker, aren't you? Yeah. Let me answer the question that came here in the chat from B. Thanks for this. The question is, are gay Christians condemned to a celibate vocation? And that's a great question that is on a lot of people's mind. Our sermon next week is it's tentatively titled, "Does Christianity Crush Diversity?" And of course, sexual diversity is seen as one of the most important types of diversity in broader culture today. So we'll have occasion to probably talk on that in more depth at the next Q&A, which is going to be later this month, because it's just such a complex, important question. But just a couple thoughts, because I don't want to punt for weeks. First of all, I would challenge the word condemned there. Are gay Christians condemned to a celibate vocation? I don't see it as a form of condemning. I see it as an invitation to a uniquely deep form of intimacy with God and with Christ. And also, by the way, the idea of a celibate vocation, that does that assume that the only types of important connections we have are sexual connections? You can have deeply enriching friendships and relationships of all sorts that touch parts that satisfy human needs that are not sexual per se. And so the question about, how do you be a gay Christian? What does that mean? And there's a lot of books about this. There's a book by a guy named David something. It's called A War of Loves. Really great book about a guy. He's Australian guy, gay guy, discovers Jesus. And it's his story. It's really quite amazing. There's several books in this genre. A book called Messy Grace. There's a book called Gay Girl, Good God. There's a variety of different things. But we'll try to explore it at more length next time. Did you want to add anything on that, Destiny?
Trying to think here. I think sometimes this question expands beyond, I think, what it should, because it assumes that it's impossible to enjoy life without sex. But I want to be very generous for those who live in our world today and just say, yeah, I mean, if there was a rope in our being, for sex, culture pulls on it regularly. I mean, it's excessive how much that is provoked. And if we're not careful, especially with devices, that can just be overdone in so many ways. And so that's just broadly speaking. So then when we then turn to the question of homosexuality or how sexual expression happens and how it is celebrated today in culture, I think we assume like, wow, I'm so sorry, we're just asking so much of you. And we almost communicate that someone is doomed to fail before they start, or that somehow Jesus is really asking a lot of you, but is probably not asking as much of me. And that should reveal a lot to us about our perception of what obedience is and even what sin is, because I think we get really riled up about, well, what are we to do with people who have sex with people that are, you know, the same gender, or who desire to be intimate with people that are the same sex as they are? What do we do with people who overeat and do so excessively to fill a void? What do we do with people who gossip excessively? What do we do with we do what we always do, and we invite Christ to do impossible work and bring us from death to life. And so again, I don't want to undermine the fact that this is a serious issue and a very good topic to be having conversations about, but I almost think that it should reveal to us more about how we perceive what obedience is and what the beauty of obedience is, more than focus on, well, should we just tell them that it's going to suck if they want to follow Jesus? So anyways, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. To be continued. It's a great question, but hope that kind of points in a direction.
Was a taste.
Yeah. Any other questions or muses or jokes or rebuttals? Isaac, never heard nothing from you, man.
Sure, I'll offer you.
Oh boy.
One from Isaac.
Settle in for another hour.
So I guess this is something more of a chew on. I'm a Christian myself, obviously. So it's more of a challenge. What did I need God for? Why can't I just necessarily be a good person? And I'm not considering myself somebody who goes around doing evil, and yet you have this Bible that says, well, I'm going to be condemned to an everlasting hell if I just don't intellectually accept that there was this Jewish man that sort of died on a cross many, many years ago. So why would I need this? Why do I not just need to be a good person? And what is the purpose of accepting this? How does it change my life?
Yes.
Will you reframe the question?
Oh, okay.
I can do it if you want.
I'll give it a go.
All right.
I need practice. Okay. Isaac, right? I think what Isaac is asking is, why isn't it enough to just be a nice, good person who contributes to the world somehow? Why do I have to mentally assent to the God that the scriptures reveal, especially in Jesus, this seemingly random Jewish guy who, probably died a pretty terrible death, it sounds like, but how is it that I owe him my life? And why do I owe him my life? And what is it that this story should be doing to me, that the story of scripture and this God behind it and in it and through it, how ought that to be affecting me? And also, why does that determine how I respond, determine whether or not I go to a place of eternal death and punishment? That seems excessive in light of what modern culture has kind of prized as the general good.
Good job.
I think I may have just resaid everything he just said.
Oh, okay.
So I apologize if I didn't distill that.
So I think, Isaac, that's a great question. And I think it has to do ultimately with the question about the nature of reality and what does it mean to bring one's life in alignment with reality, and what makes one truly human, and can one be truly human without bringing their life into alignment with reality? And if it is true that we are indeed creatures made, if it is true that there are indeed things that we cannot know without somebody telling us from without, then to reject those things is at a deep level. I don't mean this in a negative way, but it has a dehumanizing function, because our life is not brought into alignment with reality. And so, did you want to say something?
I'm just thinking out loud here. If we make niceness or contributions to society, because this is the kind of language that I think people use when they talk about this kind of question. I'm nice, I'm good, I have a family that I love, take care of them, I'm not particularly selfish, I don't think, right? If niceness or goodness in any general sense is the metric, we then have to, it just begs another question, which is important. How do we know that this good that we're referring to, or this niceness that we're referring to, is what we ought to be doing? And if we talk about oughts, there's moral conversations happening there. And then we get back to the same question, which is, where does this all come from? Why is it all here? And because you can't have conversations about what we ought to be doing, or what is the best thing to be doing, or it's enough to just be good or nice or this or that, and not also be having those other conversations. I feel like it's a question up here that ends up just leading to questions that end up going back to origins anyway. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Isaac,
Is that fair?
Are you convinced?
Wow, I was not expecting that response.
That's the Isaac test.
I was
a high.
To be like, nah, not really. I think it's a worthy question, though. I mean, I as a Christian who loves discovering more about the Hebrew scriptures and about Jesus, constantly ask myself, like, is it not weird to all of us that this guy was Jewish and that he lived on the earth and that we worship him and that somehow he's back in heaven with God sitting at the right, like, what? This is strange stuff for us. Like, this is not the language that we speak normally. And I think that resonates with people, just that's strange. And in another strange way, somehow by leaning into that very story that's very odd and seems very incongruent with the types of ways that we talk and live and think today, we become more in alignment with what is actually real. That is crazy. And it's beautiful when you experience it, but you can't get other people to experience it unless they opt in, right? You talk about this, unless they run the experiment. They have to kind of, not everything can be experienced from the outside. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm asking that a lot because I'm talking a lot and then I have no idea if it makes sense.
No, it's good.
I'm really hoping it does.
It's good. It's good. I think we're getting close to time. We're about an hour and a half in. Unless anybody else, Haley Rain, I knew it. You're like a buzzer beater shot kind of girl.
Love it.
All right, at the buzzer. What's
Love
the
it.
question? She's gonna throw a big bomb. I know it.
So I'm not trying to like misrepresent what you said. I could have understood it wrong, but earlier you were saying that a job doesn't necessarily like have to do with the path God wants us to be on. And I'm aware that for most history, people haven't had a choice, but we happen to be in a place where we can choose where we want to work and what we want to do. And we do have gifts God gave us for reasons. And I am very artistic and I have a good idea of what I want to do for the future with my gifts. But I was just wondering, does God have a big play in like our jobs, or is that just not as big of a deal of a thing of like, yeah, that's like a side kind of thing? Or that's a great question.
You mind if I take a whack at it?
No, please. I was also just going to say that I appreciate the follow-up on this because I felt like it was lacking in the beginning too. So thank you for following up.
So the question for friends online has to do with, does God really care about what job we have and how we earn money and how we spend our time? Doesn't God have more important things to worry about than where I get my paycheck from? And so I think that's there's levels of this question. So the Bible orients us to the idea that humans have a task from God to be like priests and kings and queens, like we're royalty and like clergy in a way, all of us, not just people who are like formal clergy like myself or people who are like the royal family or whatever, but it's the deep function of the idea of a priest is someone who brings the praises of the world to God and stands at the link point between one realm and another. The Latin term for a priest is a pontifex. It means a bridge maker, gapping something. And a royal king and queen, what do? They administer justice. They ensure the blessing of everyone entrusted to them. And so in fulfilling those functions as human beings, we are fulfilling our vocation at a high level, not vocation in terms of I'm a plumber, I work at a grocery store, I'm a school teacher, whatever. We're talking about a high level. But I think what's important then is to see how to connect the dots between that high level vocation and the specific things to which we are called. So I know, Haley, Rain, I hope you don't mind that I share. I know that you're a writer, right? And so say someone who writes books, how is that part of the human vocation, that specific vocation of being a writer? How is that part of the broader human vocation? Well, I think you could see it in terms of just the priesthood dimension of reflecting on truth and what is real in the world. And by the way, that doesn't mean like theology, like a novelist does this in profound ways. Somebody who writes, like, say, investigative journalism does this in profound ways. Different genres all bear witness to the writing task of telling the truth and of bringing forth truth in the world. And that is related to what it means to be a human being. But let's say, for example, I worked construction for many years, okay? I mean, like, and I hated it and I sucked at it, but I did it because I needed money and I needed a job and, whatever. But like, I built houses and built foundations. I was in the mud doing concrete and stuff like that. Now, what does that have to do with the human vocation? Well, God has made humans to have an ordering, a function. God co-creates with us. God made the world, but we are part of God's plan for the continued creation of the world and beautification and bringing order to the world. So when I'm in the mud making a house framework, like the footings or whatever, I'm actually bringing order into the world, which is something that God wants me to do. Now, let me answer maybe what might be your real question here, which is, how do I know if I'm in the right thing that God wants me to do? Can I make a wrong decision? Can I do the wrong thing? I personally believe that God relates to us on different individual levels, and that if you seek God in this domain, he will be very present and he will help you find the right job in the right season, because you have different seasons of life, right? And so the right use of your energy and time in the right season, that God will help. And that doesn't mean there's not often tensions. Often when you pray in this realm, your first recognition is, wow, I don't like my current job. Wow, what am I doing with my life? Wow, something needs to change, but I don't know what it is. So that's not to say that it's going to just be like, I love my job my whole life. In fact, it often produces real discomfort as you're aware of the gap between what you want to be doing and what you want to be and what you are doing, what you are, But to answer your point, yes, God cares about it, but I think there's also scope for human choice. Mm-hmm. I think there's also scope for human mistakes. There's scope for us having seasons of life. My dad has always said, I think we should all have a job once that we hate. You know why? So that you learn the discipline of showing up because it's your duty, not because you want to do it and it gives you like deep existential joy, but because you're like, it's my job and I said I would do it and I will be there. And learning how to do those kinds of things is an important part of maturity, because there's going to be a lot of things in life you don't want to do and you do them anyways because you must. And so, developing that moral fiber is an important part of what employment builds in us as human beings. So I hope I answered your question. It's a question I think about a lot. And I think the reason it's such an important question is, if we don't understand how our vocation maps onto what it means to be a human being, what it means to be Christian, what it means to be fully alive, then we have basically marginalized the bulk of our life, the bulk of our waking hours, into a bucket that says irrelevant. Mm-hmm. That's a tremendous mistake. We must find a way to identify the deep meaning within whatever work we do, whatever work God's called us to do. It's a great book by Michael Novak, who's a philosopher. It's called Business as a Calling. And say you're in business world in some dimension. Can you see that as a calling from God? You certainly can. And there, but it's about seeing it the right way, seeing what value it adds, seeing what its mission is. And business as a calling, but you could extrapolate from that to a variety of other teaching as a calling, building as a calling, law enforcement as a calling, a variety of different things. But the key here is to see how our specific jobs link up to the larger human vocation, and asking God to direct you as one specific person to find your place within that larger framework. Yeah, great question. Great question. Shall we put a pin in it there, my friends? Because the 49ers are on. I mean, because we've talked quite a long time, and I'm talked out. Destiny, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sharing a lot of insights and wisdom. And
thank you so much.
It's been fun. I hope it's been helpful. And later this month, we will do it again.
Woo-hoo.
So, all right. Take care, everybody. Shalom, me homies. Okay.